My name is Helen Marsh, and I want to start with the word unstable, because that word cost me 14 months of my life, and I want you to understand exactly what it means when someone with enough money and enough motivation attaches it to a mother in a family courtroom. Unstable is not a diagnosis. It is not a finding. It is not the conclusion of a careful and independent clinical assessment conducted by a professional with no stake in the outcome. When my ex-husband James used it in his custody application in the spring of 2 years ago, it was a strategy. A word selected for its specific effect on a family court judge who has limited time and a crowded docket and who reads the word unstable in a sworn statement and files it in the part of their mind reserved for risk and pays attention to it whether they mean to or not. James had paid a doctor to give that word a medical address. I did not know that at first. I found out later in the way I found out most things during those 14 months. Slowly, and through the accumulation of details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. What I knew at the beginning was this. A psychiatrist named Dr. Graham Elliott had submitted a report to the family court, stating that in his clinical opinion I presented with significant indicators of emotional dysregulation, an impaired judgment that raised concerns about my capacity to provide consistent and stable care for our daughter Lily. Lily was 5 years old. She had blonde hair and a gap between her front teeth and a collection of smooth stones she called her treasures, and kept in a tin under her bed. She was funny and fierce and entirely herself, and she had been living with me in our flat in Bristol since James and I separated 18 months earlier, and she was thriving in every measurable way that a 5-year-old could thrive. None of that was in Dr. Graham Elliott's report. What was in his report was a clinical assessment conducted over 2 sessions that I had attended, believing it was a standard welfare evaluation requested by the court. I had answered his questions honestly. I had described the separation and the stress of the preceding year, and the particular exhaustion of being a single parent, and the occasional anxiety that came with managing everything alone. I had been honest because I believed honesty was what the assessment required. I did not know that Dr. Graham Elliott had been referred to James by James's solicitor. I did not know that he had conducted assessments in 3 previous cases involving clients of the same firm, and had reached conclusions favourable to the referring party in all 3. I did not know any of this until a woman named Dr. Priya Sharma sat across from me in a small office in Bristol and read me his report line by line and told me what she saw in it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the spring morning when I sat in my solicitor's office and read Dr. Graham Elliott's report for the first time and felt the ground move beneath me in the particular way it moves when someone has built something against you and you are only now seeing its full shape. My solicitor's name was Janet Cole, and she had been handling my case since the separation. And she had the particular quality of a person who delivers difficult information without softening it into something more comfortable, because she understood that comfort in the short term and clarity in the long term were not always the same thing, and that her job required the second one even when the first one was tempting. She slid the report across the desk on a Tuesday morning in April, and she said, "Read it carefully, and then tell me what you think." I read it carefully. It took me 20 minutes, and I read certain sections twice, and by the time I put it down my hands were not entirely steady, and I had the particular sensation of someone who has been looking at a portrait they thought was of a stranger, and has slowly understood it is of them. Dr. Graham Elliott's report described a woman who presented with elevated anxiety and difficulty regulating emotional responses under stress. A woman who demonstrated a pattern of catastrophizing in her descriptions of the separation and its aftermath. A woman whose account of her parenting capacity contained indicators of what he termed unrealistic self-assessment, meaning she believed she was coping better than the clinical evidence suggested. A woman who, in his professional opinion, would benefit from significant therapeutic intervention before being considered the primary caregiver for a child of Lily's age. I put the report down. I looked at Janet. I said, I sat in that room and I answered his questions honestly. I told him I found things difficult sometimes. I told him I had anxiety about the future. I told him I was tired. Those are not symptoms. Those are the ordinary responses of a person going through a separation while raising a child alone. Janet looked at me. She said, I know that. The question is whether we can demonstrate it to a judge who has this report in front of them, and no competing clinical voice to measure it against. I asked her what she meant by competing clinical voice. She said, a second opinion. An independent assessment conducted by a psychiatrist with no connection to James or his legal team. Someone who will evaluate the same things Dr. Elliot evaluated and reach their own conclusions based solely on what they find. If the conclusions differ significantly from Elliot's, then the court has two clinical voices and must decide which one to trust. If the conclusions align, then we need to know that now rather than later. I asked her how we found someone. She said she had a name. A psychiatrist in Bristol named Dr. Priya Sharma, who had 20 years of experience in family court assessments, and who had a reputation for reports that were scrupulously independent and that judges trusted precisely, because she had no history of consistent alignment with any particular legal firm or any particular outcome. I asked when she could see me. Janet said, I called her this morning. She can see you Thursday. I looked at the report on the desk between us. I thought about Dr. Graham Elliot and his 2 sessions and his carefully chosen words. I thought about James and his solicitor and the referral that I had not known about. I thought about Lily at school right now with her gap-toothed smile and her treasures tin, and her complete unawareness that a document existed, describing her mother as a woman whose judgment was impaired, and whose capacity for stable care was in question. I thought about Thursday. I thought, let him find out what an independent assessment looks like. Dr. Priya Sharma's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Queen Square in Bristol, with a view of the garden in the centre of the square, that on a Thursday morning in April was exactly the kind of view you needed when you were about to spend 2 hours being assessed by a psychiatrist for the 2nd time in 3 months and needed something outside yourself to look at while you gathered everything you had. She met me at the door herself, 50-something, dark hair with threads of grey, wearing a plain grey cardigan and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She shook my hand with the direct grip of someone who has been doing serious work for long enough that the formality of professional meetings has become simply the natural way she moved through them. Her office was orderly without being immaculate. Books on shelves that had clearly been read rather than arranged. A plant on the windowsill that was thriving. 2 chairs angled toward each other with a small table between them. No desk between us, no barrier. Just 2 chairs and the space between them and whatever I brought into it. Sit down, she said. Tell me why you are here. I told her everything. Not the version I had told Dr. Graham Elliot. The careful, honest account of my difficulties and my exhaustion and my anxiety. The account that had been taken and shaped into something clinical and damaging. The full version. The separation and James and Lily, and the custody application, and Dr. Elliot's report, and what it had said about me, and what I believed about why it had said it. She listened without writing anything down for the first 20 minutes. Just listened with the focused attention of someone cataloguing what they were hearing, and building their own picture of it before they began asking questions. Then she asked questions. Not the questions Dr. Elliot had asked. Not the questions designed to surface anxiety and stress and the ordinary difficulties of a difficult period, and frame them as clinical indicators. Questions about my daily life with Lily, about our routines and our relationship and the specific ordinary texture of our life together, about how I managed when things were hard, and what I did when I was overwhelmed, and who I turned to, and how I recovered. About my work, I was a secondary school librarian, and my friendships and the support structures around me. About my history before James and after James and the person I was when nobody was assessing me. 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, and she looked at me with the direct eyes of a woman who has spent 20 years reading people in assessment rooms and has learned to trust what she sees. She said, "I'm going to be honest with you about something before I write this report." I said, "Please." She said, "I have read Dr. Elliott's assessment. Janet sent it to me before your appointment. I want you to know that the clinical picture he describes and the clinical picture I am seeing in this room are not the same picture. They are not even close to the same picture. What he has described as emotional dysregulation, I would describe as the entirely appropriate stress response of a person managing a genuinely stressful situation. What he has described as impaired judgment, I would describe as honest self-reflection. I want you to know that the clinical picture he describes and the clinical picture I am seeing in this room are not the same picture. They are not even close to the same picture. What he has described as emotional dysregulation, I would describe as the entirely appropriate stress response of a person managing a genuinely stressful situation. What he has described as impaired judgment, I would describe as honest self-reflection. What he has described as unrealistic self-assessment, I would describe as accurate self-assessment, meaning you know exactly how hard things are, and you are managing them competently regardless. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Why would his picture be so different from yours?" She looked at me steadily. She said, "That is a question I cannot answer without more information. What I can tell you is that in 20 years of family court assessments, I have encountered reports that read the way his report reads, and in my experience, those reports share certain characteristics. They use clinical language selectively. They weight negative indicators heavily and positive indicators lightly. They reach conclusions that serve a particular outcome rather than following the evidence where it leads. I am not making an allegation. I am telling you what I observe." I looked at the plant on the windowsill. I thought about James and his solicitor, and the referral I had not known about. I thought about 3 previous cases and 3 conclusions favourable to the referring party. I thought about what Janet had said about competing clinical voices, and which one a judge would trust. I thought, Dr. Priya Sharma is about to give James the answer to that question. Dr. Priya Sharma's report arrived at Janet's office 2 weeks. LATRI. Read it on a Monday morning sitting at Janet's desk with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and the particular focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a document that matters and is now reading every word of it with the understanding that every word has weight. It was 14 pages. Dr. Elliott's report had been 9. The additional 5 pages were not padding. They were the difference between a report that reached for a conclusion and a report that built toward one with the methodical care of someone who understood that their professional credibility rested on the integrity of their process and was not willing to compromise it for any outcome. Dr. Sharma's report described a woman with strong emotional intelligence and a well-developed capacity for self-reflection. A woman whose anxiety, where present, was situationally appropriate and did not impair her functioning. A woman with a consistent and nurturing parenting style, evidenced by specific observations from the assessment and corroborated by the account of Lily's school, which Dr. Sharma had contacted directly as part of her evaluation. A woman who, in her professional opinion, demonstrated no clinical indicators that would give cause for concern regarding her capacity to provide stable and consistent primary care for a child of Lily's age. Then came the section I had not expected. Dr. Sharma had included a comparative analysis of her findings and Dr. Elliott's findings. Not an attack. Where she had noted situational anxiety, he had noted emotional dysregulation. Where she had noted honest self-reflection, he had noted unrealistic self-assessment. Where she had noted appropriate stress response, he had noted impaired judgment. In each instance, she explained her own reasoning and left the reader to draw their own conclusions about his. She also included a section I had not known she was going to write. She had researched Dr. Graham Elliott's professional history in family court proceedings. She had identified 7 cases in the previous 4 years in which he had submitted assessments. In 6 of those 7 cases, the assessment had been commissioned by the same legal firm, James's legal firm, Hartley and Associates. In 5 of those 6 cases, his conclusions had supported the position of the commissioning party. 5 out of 6. I put the report down. Janet was watching me from across the desk. I said, "She found the pattern." Janet said, "She found the pattern. And she has documented it in a way that is going to be very difficult for James's legal team to dismiss as coincidence or professional disagreement." I asked what happened now. She said, "I am submitting both reports to the court this week, with a formal request that the judge consider the conflict between them and the professional history I have now documented. I am also making a separate application for the court to appoint its own independent psychiatrist, a third voice with no connection to either party, to conduct a final assessment and provide the court with a clinical opinion that neither side can challenge on the grounds of bias." I thought about that. "A third voice," I said. "Yes," Janet said, "because 2 conflicting reports give a judge a choice between 2 competing narratives. A third independent voice gives them a resolution. And given the pattern Dr. Sharma has identified in Elliott's professional history, I am confident about which direction that resolution is going to go." I looked at the 14-page report on the desk between us. I thought about Dr. Graham Elliott and his 9 pages and his carefully selected clinical language, and the 5 out of 6 conclusions that had favoured the party paying his referral fees. I thought about James and his calculation that a medical opinion, properly dressed in clinical language and submitted to a court that trusted medical opinions, would be enough. I thought about Dr. Priya Sharma and her plant on the windowsill, and 20 years of assessments that judges trusted precisely because she had never given them a reason not to. Then I picked up my tea. It was cold. I drank it anyway. The court-appointed psychiatrist was a man named Dr. Robert K., and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent 30 years being trusted by judges and had internalized that trust as a professional standard rather than a reputation to be managed. He was methodical and unhurried, and he conducted his assessment over 3 sessions across 2 weeks. And he asked questions that covered the same ground Dr. Elliott had covered, and the same ground Dr. Sharma had covered, and some ground that neither of them had covered. And I answered everything with the same honesty I had brought to both previous assessments, because honesty was the only position I had ever had, and I was not going to change it now, simply because the stakes were higher. The 3rd session ended on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Dr. K walked me to the door of his office, and he shook my hand and he said, "Thank you for your time and cooperation throughout this process." He said it with the formal courtesy of professional conclusion, and I thanked him, and I went to my car, and I sat in the car park and I called Janet. She said, "How did it feel?" I said, "Like being seen accurately for the first time since this started." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. That is what we needed it to feel like." Dr. K's report arrived at the court 3 weeks later. Janet received a copy the same day and called me at 7 in the evening, which told me before she said a word that the content was significant enough to warrant a 7 o'clock call rather than a Tuesday morning meeting. She read me the conclusion directly. Dr. K had found no clinical indicators of emotional dysregulation, impaired judgment, or any other presentation that would give cause for concern regarding the subject's capacity to provide stable and consistent primary care for a child. He had found, in direct contrast to Dr. Elliott's assessment, a woman with strong emotional resilience, well-developed coping strategies, and a parenting approach that he described as responsive, consistent, and appropriately attuned to the child's developmental needs. He had also included something that Janet said she had not seen in a court-appointed assessment in 23 years of practice. A direct reference to the conflict between the two prior reports. Dr. K had written, having reviewed both the assessment submitted by Dr. Graham Elliott and the assessment submitted by Dr. Priya Sharma, and having conducted my own independent evaluation, I find myself in complete alignment with Dr. Sharma's clinical findings and unable to identify the evidential basis for several of Dr. Elliott's conclusions. The discrepancy between Dr. Elliott's assessment and the assessments of both Dr. Sharma and myself is significant, enough that I would respectfully suggest the court consider whether Dr. Elliott's report represents an independent clinical evaluation, or whether it may have been shaped by factors outside the clinical evidence. I sat on my sofa with the phone in my hand and I let those words settle. Factors outside the clinical evidence. A court-appointed psychiatrist had just told the family court, in language as careful and precise as his professional standing required, that Dr. Graham Elliott's report smelled wrong. I thought about James and his calculation, the referred psychiatrist and the 9 pages of clinical language, and the word unstable given a medical address. The assumption that a mother with no money for a competing expert could be described into a corner she could not argue her way out of. I thought about Janet Cole saying a competing clinical voice on a Tuesday morning in April, and Dr. Priya Sharma's plant on the windowsill, and 14 pages that had built toward a conclusion rather than reaching for one. I thought about Lily at home right now with my mother, who had come to stay for the week, being read to in the way Lily demanded to be read to, with full character voices and no skipping of pages regardless of length. She had no idea what was happening. She did not need to. She just needed her mother to win. The final hearing was on a Thursday in November. I want to tell you it was dramatic. I want to tell you there was a moment of revelation and a gasp from the gallery, and a judge who delivered justice with the weight and ceremony the situation deserved. It was not like that. It was a small courtroom and a Thursday morning and 2 tables and a judge who had read 3 psychiatric reports and a pattern analysis and a professional history, and had arrived at her conclusions before any of us said a word. Judge Carolyn Webb was in her 60s, precise and economical in everything she said, and she conducted the hearing with the efficient thoroughness of someone who understood that the families in front of her had been living inside this process for 14 months and deserved to have it resolved clearly and completely, and without unnecessary extension. She dismissed James's custody application in its entirety. She granted me primary residence with a structured contact arrangement for James that the welfare officer had recommended, and that prioritized Lily's stability and continuity above everything else. She made a formal referral regarding Dr. Graham Elliott to the General Medical Council, citing the conflict between his assessment and the 2 independent assessments and the professional history documented in Dr. Sharma's report. She noted in her written judgment that the court had serious concerns about the independence and integrity of Dr. Elliott's assessment, and that those concerns warranted investigation by the relevant professional body. And she awarded full costs against James. Not partial costs. Full costs. Every penny of 14 months of legal proceedings to be paid by the man who had initiated them on the basis of a report he had commissioned from a psychiatrist his own solicitor had referred him to, and who had a documented pattern of reaching conclusions that served the referring party. I sat beside Janet when the judge finished speaking, and I did not cry. I had thought I would cry. I had imagined the moment of it for 14 months in the way you imagine things that are too important to think about directly, and so you approach them sideways in the small hours of the morning when you cannot sleep. I had imagined relief and release and the particular undoing of something that had been held tight for too long. What I felt instead was quieter than that, more settled. The feeling of a foundation that had been undermined being restored. Not rebuilt, restored, because it had always been there. The truth of who I was, and how I parented, and what Lily's life with me actually looked like, had always been there. It had simply needed 3 psychiatrists and 14 months and a judge with the clarity to see through 9 pages of selectively applied clinical language to acknowledge it. James did not look at me when the hearing ended. He gathered his papers and he left with Richard Pierce beside him, and the particular posture of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, and is not yet ready to process what that means. I did not watch him go. I had spent 14 months being defined by his version of me, and I was done looking in the direction he was moving. Dr. Graham Elliott was investigated by the General Medical Council. The investigation took 8 months. He received a formal reprimand and was required to complete supervised practice for 2 years. It was not the outcome I would have chosen. Janet said it was the outcome the evidence supported, given the standard of proof required. I accepted that because accepting things that are imperfect but real is something I'd become practiced at over the previous 14 months. Dr. Priya Sharma sent me a card when the hearing concluded. A plain card with a handwritten note that said, "I'm glad the process worked as it should. Look after yourself and that little girl." I put it on my bookshelf, and it is still there. Lily is 7 now. She still has the gap between her front teeth, which her dentist says will close in its own time, and which I hope takes as long as possible because it is entirely her, and entirely perfect. She still has the treasures tin under her bed, 21 stones at last count, each one selected according to criteria she has never fully explained. She still demands full character voices during reading and full page completion, and will not accept shortcuts on either count. She does not know what happened in those 14 months. She knows her parents live separately. She knows that sometimes things are complicated. She does not know about Dr. Graham Elliott, or his 9 pages, or the word unstable given a medical address to be used as a weapon in a family court. She will know one day, when she is old enough to receive it and decide what she thinks about it. That is her right. What she knows now is that her mother picks her up from school on Tuesday and Thursday, and every other weekend, and is always there when she says she will be, and never says a thing she does not mean. That has always been true. It always will be.